Today we'll be talking about the endosymbiotic theory. Wait, what's that? Well, to put it simply, the endosymbiotic theory is the theory that eukaryotic cells evolved from an ancient bacteria cell. That sounds complicated. It's okay, let's start off with some simple definitions first. We can begin by breaking down the term endosymbiotic theory. We have endo, which is the Latin term for in or within. If you think about it, endoskeleton is an internal skeleton, and endotoxin is a toxin inside of a cell. Symbiosis pretty much means teamwork. It's a close and often long-term interaction between two different biological species. So together, it's teamwork inside of something, right? Inside. You may remember the movie Finding Nemo. In the movie, Nemo's family lived in a sea anemone. Well, by living there, the clownfish became immune to its sting. And in return for the home, the fish lured in other food for the anemone to eat. They also ate its dead tentacles, which is a really good example of symbiosis. Now, as for theory, in science, a theory is not just an assumption. It's a well-sustained explanation that's acquired through the scientific method. Symbiosis pretty much means teamwork. It's a close and often long-term interaction between two different biological species. So together, prokaryotic cells are very simple single-celled organisms. They do not have a membrane-bound nucleus or any other membrane-bound organism. In fact, the name comes from the Greek pro, which means before, and karyon, which means kernel. The kernel is the membrane-bound nucleus, so we can already assume that these cells came before the cells with a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are not divided up by membrane walls. Instead, they just consist of one big open space. In this open space, they have a nucleoid, which is basically a nucleus-like region in the cell, since they don't have a true nucleus. Nucleoid is where the cell's DNA can be found. It's a large circular strand that is called a circular chromosome. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are larger than the previous prokaryotic cell. They also have a true nucleus, meaning that their DNA is surrounded by a membrane-bound organelle. We also see the origin of the name coming into effect here. It's Greek as well, the U meaning after, and of course the karyote meaning kernel. So this cell came after the kernel or the nucleus. These prokaryotic cells also do contain other membrane-bound organelles such as mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, ER, and sometimes chloroplast. In contrast to their counterpart, eukaryotic cells have linear, rod-shaped chromosomes instead of the... Now it's time for the endosymbiotic theory. Let's meet the cast. Host cell, starring as host cell. He's a primitive eukaryote that is also anaerobic, meaning that he is not able to tolerate oxygen of any kind. Host cell is also a heterotroph, meaning that he cannot make his own food. Instead, he must get his food and energy by taking in organic substances. In case you were wondering how we already had a eukaryotic cell in this scenario, it's a very primitive eukaryote, so it's really not the cell that we know today. It doesn't have mitochondria. This cell arose when a prokaryote lost its cell wall. The more flexible membrane underneath then began to grow and fold in on itself, which in turn led to the formation of a nucleus and other internal membranes. Introducing the ancient bacterium. It is hypothesized that this bacteria was Rickettsia or a purple sulfur bacteria. It's the prokaryote in the endosymbiotic theory, and although it's ancient, it's still very similar to true bacteria today. Ancient bacteria is aerobic, meaning that it can tolerate oxygen. It is also an autotroph, meaning that it can make its own food, which it does by cellular respiration, where it takes in the food and converts it to energy. Tune in for a special feature presentation. In a land far, far before time. In a time even further back than dinosaurs, further back than plants or animals, was the host cell. During this time, the atmosphere was composed primarily of nitrogen and carbon dioxide. One big host cell was very happy hanging out being lazy all day long, until one day he'd noticed that everything began to change. On this day, a new organism was born, an organism that changed everything with a process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis introduced oxygen to the atmosphere, which was a huge problem for the host cell, who is anaerobic and wasn't able to tolerate oxygen. And he heard a frightened cry coming from a much smaller cell. Help me! Well, this aerobic cell could make its own food and turn it into energy, which looked especially appetizing to the big, lazy host cell that still relied on glycolysis and fermentation. So he swallowed up the little guy. However, he didn't digest the smaller prokaryote. Instead, he used its energy and felt better than ever. He even gained the ability to aerobically digest food from his symbiont. The ancient bacteria was perfectly fine with this new relationship because he now had a new friend that kept him warm and safe. His new friend even provided him with all kinds of nutrients that he could pig out on all day. In return, the bacteria converted the food and nutrients into energy for the lazy host cell. Eventually, the two fell in love and formed a special relationship called symbiosis. The two couldn't live without each other at this point. They had co-evolved with one another. At the point of coevolution, genes that coded for proteins that the prokaryote needed had transferred to the host cell. The prokaryote could no longer live independently. It also depended on the host cell for essential nutrients. So I guess the host cell wore the pants? As the host cell and bacteria cell co-evolved to become one unit, you may be able to recognize the bacteria cell as an organelle we now know as the mitochondrion. In this diagram, you can see that original primitive eukaryote, which then eventually takes in the bacteria cell. And then you can see where they co-evolve together and you get this little organelle in the new cell. The organelle and the final product should look familiar to you. It's what we now know as the mitochondrion. If you look at the cell as a whole, hopefully you'll be able to recognize that as well. You have this little mitochondria right here. You also have the nucleus. If you think back to the information that was provided at the beginning of the video, you might be able to figure out that this is a eukaryotic cell, more specifically, animal cell. The eukaryotic cell is the final product of the endosymbiotic theory. So we started with the bacterial cell that the host cell eventually engulfed, that the two co-evolved to become what we now know as this here eukaryotic cell. Final eukaryotic cell lived a very happy life, bearing many daughters that would eventually grow up to be a much better cell than the original duo ever could have been. The end. Now you might be thinking that it's a shot in the dark to assume that our cells, human cells as we know today that are so complex, evolved from a tiny bacteria cell, but there's actually a lot of evidence to support this theory. Essentially, all our evidence around the endosymbiotic theory pertains to how similar mitochondria from a present eukaryotic cell is to that ancient aerobic bacteria. For instance, mitochondria use oxygen in the production of ATP, just like bacteria does. They also both do this using the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. Mitochondria and the ancient bacteria are also very similar in size. They both range from about 1 to 10 microns. Mitochondria also reproduce like bacteria. They reproduce by simple binary fission, where they basically pinch in half and divide equally. They also do this independently of the cell that they live in. Each mitochondria has its own DNA genome. Their DNA consists of a single large loop called a circular chromosome. Similarly, DNA's bacteria is circular. Because they're responsible for their own DNA, each mitochondrion can only be produced by a parent mitochondria through, again, binary fission. And finally, the mitochondria in eukaryotic cells have double phospholipid bilayers. The original ancient bacteria had only one phospholipid bilayer, but when the bacteria entered the host cell, it was bound by a vesicle which formed the second bilayer, similar to that of mitochondria. Part 2. After the events previously described, the host cell still wasn't completely satisfied, but then he met cyanobacteria. Meet cyanobacteria. It's a bacteria that's capable of photosynthesis, which is converting sunlight into energy. The cyanobacteria looked especially appetizing to this host cell, which was no longer lazy because it had the mitochondria, but it wasn't able to photosynthesize. So it engulfed the second portion, cyanobacteria, and then that as a whole co-evolved. Final product in this case might also look familiar to you because this is a plant cell instead of an animal cell, which occurred when the host cell took in the ancient bacteria instead of the cyanobacteria. And the evidence for the two are essentially the same. Chloroplast mitochondria are very. You can see in this diagram where the host cell that contained the mitochondria also engulfed the cyanobacteria, which eventually co-evolved to what we now know as previously stated, the plant cell. Now just to summarize, we have here in the beginning the host cell, which was a primitive eukaryote where you see the enfolding of the plasma membrane, which then engulfs the ancient bacteria that evolves to become the mitochondrion. And now just to summarize, we have here in the beginning the host cell, which was a primitive eukaryote where you see the enfolding of the plasma membrane, which then engulfs the ancient bacteria that evolves to become the mitochondrion. And that's the endosymbiotic theory. Well, that wasn't so bad. You did great. Thanks for watching and join us next time.